The dinner table was set, each piece of silverware placed with meticulous precision, just as Emily always liked it. Our anniversary was her favorite occasion, a celebration of what she called our perfect union. Tonight, though, the words felt hollow in my mind. The air in the room seemed thicker than usual, heavy with the weight of a truth I wasn't ready to share. I adjusted my tie in the mirror and stared at my reflection. My face betrayed the storm brewing inside me. The memories of the past weeks, the discovery of her deception, the gut-wrenching betrayal, played on an endless loop in my mind. My heart thudded in my chest, a steady reminder that this wasn't just another night. The first sign came innocuously, as these things often do. It was a Tuesday morning, a typical flurry of activity as we rushed to get the kids off to school. I had just finished packing their lunches when I noticed Emily's purse, left carelessly on the counter. Next to it, partially hidden beneath a stack of receipts and papers, was a folded piece of paper. It caught my attention for no reason other than its unusual placement. Emily was meticulous about keeping her belongings organized. I unfolded it, expecting to find a grocery list or a note from the kids. Instead, it was a receipt, a single night at a luxury hotel downtown, dated for the previous weekend. My heart sank. That weekend, she had been on a business retreat, or so she said. I tried to shake the unease that crept in, but the seed of doubt was already planted. I told myself it was a mistake, that there was an explanation, but deep down, I knew better. Later that evening, as Emily bustled around the kitchen, humming to herself, I watched her with a mixture of love and suspicion. Could this vibrant, loving woman, the mother of my children, truly betray me? The thought felt alien, impossible. Yet the receipt in my pocket said otherwise. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I started observing, piecing together the small inconsistencies I had overlooked. Her phone, always glued to her hand, seemed to vibrate more often now, though she never showed me who was calling. She began working late, attending more meetings, her explanations increasingly vague. My curiosity turned to action when I decided to dig deeper. I waited for her to fall asleep, her breathing slow and steady, before slipping her phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up, and I hesitated, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. But the need for answers outweighed my guilt. Her messages were innocuous at first, chats with coworkers, group texts with friends. Then I saw his name, Greg. The thread began innocently enough, discussions about work and upcoming projects. But as I scrolled further back, the tone shifted. Messages became flirtatious, playful, and finally, damning. One stood out, "Can't wait for our next retreat. Counting the days until I can hold you again." My world crumbled. I sat there in the dark, my hands trembling as I tried to process what I was reading. Emily, the woman I had loved for over a decade, was having an affair. The next morning, I felt like a ghost, moving through the motions of our routine as though nothing had changed. Emily kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, her smile bright and carefree. I watched her go, the image of her laughter from the night before clashing with the betrayal I now knew. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more than just a few messages. If this was the battle I was heading into, I needed to be prepared. That evening, I contacted a private investigator, a man named Carl who came highly recommended. Within days, he had confirmed what I feared: Emily and Greg had been meeting regularly for over 2 years. The photos Carl provided were the final nail in the coffin. They weren't lurid, just quiet moments of intimacy, a hand on her back, a shared laugh, a lingering gaze. They spoke of a connection that should have been mine and mine alone. Still, I didn't confront her. Instead, I began planning. I wasn't just going to walk away, I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done. She had taken our life, our love, and trampled on it. If she thought she could do that without consequences, she was wrong. The days following my discovery were a haze. Each moment felt like a balancing act between rage and sorrow, between the desire for confrontation and the need for careful strategy. Every morning I watched Emily move through the house with the same grace and ease she'd always had, as if nothing had changed. She didn't know I was aware, and I took advantage of that. Carl, the private investigator, continued his work, feeding me details as they came. Greg was married too, which added an extra layer of irony to the situation. His wife, Claire, seemed oblivious, her social media full of happy family photos. Knowing there was another victim in this web of lies only deepened my resolve. I wasn't just doing this for me, I was going to bring the truth to light for all of us. One evening, as Emily sat at the dining table sorting through papers, I made a casual comment. "What's Greg like? You've mentioned him a few times." My tone was light, casual, like a husband trying to take an interest in his wife's work. She looked up, startled, but quickly recovered. "Greg? Oh, he's just a colleague. We work on a few projects together." I nodded, pretending to be satisfied with her answer. "You two must spend a lot of time together, given how often you mention him." Emily shrugged. "It's just work. Nothing more." I wondered if she could see the storm brewing behind my neutral expression, but she didn't press further. Instead, she returned to her papers, oblivious to the fact that her carefully constructed facade was already crumbling. A week later, I visited a lawyer. Her name was Amanda Reed, and she came highly recommended by Carl. When I laid out the evidence and my plan, she listened carefully, her face betraying no emotion. "You've got a solid case," she said finally. "But if you're looking for revenge, you need to be prepared for the fallout. This won't just affect Emily. Your kids will feel it too." "I'm not looking for revenge," I lied. "I just want what's fair." Amanda raised an eyebrow but didn't challenge me. Instead, she outlined the steps we would take. The first was securing my financial position. Emily and I had a joint account, but I quietly moved a significant portion into a separate account under my name. I also ensured that the house and other major assets were protected. By the time Emily's betrayal became public, she wouldn't just lose my trust, she would lose everything she had taken for granted. The closer I got to my goal, the more difficult it became to maintain my composure. Emily's lies were like a splinter under my skin, a constant irritant that I couldn't ignore. One evening, I came dangerously close to losing control. She was on the phone with Greg, her voice low and conspiratorial as she laughed at something he'd said. I stood in the doorway, watching her with a mix of anger and sadness. When she hung up, she turned and saw me standing there. "Oh, hey," she said, smiling. "I didn't hear you come in." "Who was that?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Just a work thing," she said, waving it off. "Nothing important." I wanted to scream, to hurl the truth at her and watch her crumble under the weight of her own lies. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded and walked away, retreating to my office where I could let the anger simmer in private. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a Friday afternoon. Carl called to inform me that Greg's wife, Claire, had been spotted meeting with him at a coffee shop. They weren't holding hands or doing anything overtly suspicious, but their body language spoke volumes. Carl had already reached out to Claire, offering her the evidence he'd collected. She had agreed to meet with me. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Claire was younger than I'd expected, with dark hair and tired eyes. She looked like someone carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. When I introduced myself, she gave me a small, strained smile. "I assume this is about Greg," she said, getting straight to the point. "Yes," I replied. "I thought you should know what's been going on." I handed her the folder Carl had prepared, watching as her face shifted from confusion to shock to quiet resignation. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. "I had my suspicions," she admitted. "But seeing it like this, it's different." "I know the feeling," I said. I've been sitting on this for weeks, trying to figure out the best way to handle it. Claire nodded, her expression hardening. What do you want to do? We deserve the truth, I said. Not just for us, but for our families. They can't keep getting away with this. She hesitated, then nodded again. You're right. They need to face the consequences. That night, as Emily and I sat down for dinner with the kids, I felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were finally in place, the stage set for the final act. Emily chatted about her day, laughing at something one of the kids said, completely unaware of what was coming. As I looked at her, I felt a pang of sadness for the life we had built together, the life she had thrown away. But that sadness was quickly replaced by resolve. She had made her choices, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The morning light seeped through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Emily was still asleep, her face serene and untroubled. For a fleeting moment, I remembered the woman I fell in love with, the laughter we shared, the dreams we built together. But that image had been shattered, replaced by the cold, undeniable truth of her betrayal. This was the day I had been preparing for. It was the culmination of weeks of quiet planning, of sleepless nights and simmering anger. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, each scenario playing out differently, but all ending the same, Emily facing the wreckage of what she had done. I rose quietly, careful not to wake her, and went downstairs. The kids were already up, their laughter echoing from the living room. I smiled despite myself. They were the one pure thing in this whole mess, and I vowed to shield them as much as I could. Dad, can we go to the park later? Emma asked, her eyes lighting up. Of course, sweetheart, I said, ruffling her hair. But let's get through breakfast first. By the time Emily came downstairs, the table was set, and the kids were eating. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, her smile bright and unburdened. It was almost enough to make me falter, almost. Later that afternoon, I met Claire again. This time, it was in a lawyer's office, a neutral ground where we could finalize the next steps. Amanda, my lawyer, had coordinated with Claire's attorney to ensure everything was airtight. We had agreed to confront Greg and Emily together, presenting the evidence and demanding accountability. You ready for this? Claire asked, her voice steady but tinged with nerves. I nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. The plan was simple. Claire had invited Greg to dinner at a nearby restaurant, under the guise of a romantic evening. I would do the same with Emily. Once they were both there, we would make our move. That evening, I watched Emily get ready. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress and applying makeup. Do I look okay? She asked, turning to face me. You look beautiful, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. She smiled, clearly pleased, and we left for the restaurant. My heart pounded in my chest as we drove, but I kept my face neutral, my tone light. She had no idea what was coming. When we arrived, Greg and Claire were already seated at a table in the corner. Emily spotted them immediately, her face lighting up. Oh, look, it's Greg and Claire. What a coincidence. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. What are the odds? We joined them, the atmosphere warm and convivial at first. Emily and Greg exchanged easy banter, completely oblivious to the storm brewing. Claire and I exchanged a glance, the weight of our shared secret heavy between us. As dinner progressed, I found myself marveling at Emily's audacity. She laughed and joked, her hand occasionally brushing against Greg's, as if I didn't exist. It was almost impressive, the ease with which she compartmentalized her double life. When the main course was served, Claire cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. There's something we need to talk about, she said, her voice calm but firm. Greg looked confused. What's going on? I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, placing it on the table between us. We know, I said simply. Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Know what?" she asked, her voice trembling. Claire opened the folder, revealing the photos, the messages, the damning evidence that laid bare their betrayal. Greg paled, his eyes darting to Claire, then to me. "This is insane," Greg stammered. "It's not what it looks like." Emily's face crumbled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mark, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," I said coldly. "I gave you my trust, my love, and this is how you repaid me." Claire turned to Greg, her voice sharp. "You lied to me. To our family. How could you?" Greg sputtered, trying to find the words, but there was no defense for what he had done. Emily reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the anger and hurt boiling over. "Do you even understand what you've done?" I demanded, my voice rising. "You've destroyed everything we built together." "I made a mistake," Emily whispered, her tears falling freely now. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice hard. Over and over again. The restaurant had fallen silent, the other patrons watching the scene unfold. Claire stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is over, Greg. I'll be speaking to my lawyer tomorrow." She turned and walked out, leaving Greg sitting there, his face a mixture of shame and desperation. Emily reached for me again, but I shook my head. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "We're done." I stood and walked away, leaving her sitting there, surrounded by the wreckage of her choices. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but as I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that hinted at the arrival of winter. I sat on a park bench, watching Emma and Ben race across the playground. Their laughter filled the air, but my mind was elsewhere. It had been weeks since the dinner where the truth exploded like a grenade, leaving nothing but shrapnel in its wake. Emily had moved out, staying with a friend while we figured out the logistics of the divorce. The house felt emptier without her, but I found solace in the quiet. Claire had been true to her word, filing for divorce from Greg almost immediately. She and I had kept in touch, partly to navigate the fallout, partly for the strange bond we now shared. She was a voice of understanding in a storm of confusion. But today was different. Today, I was meeting someone, a man named Richard. Claire had arranged the meeting, insisting it was important. She hadn't given me much detail, only that it involved Greg and Emily. "Mark," a deep voice pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see a man in his early 40s, dressed sharply in a tailored coat. His expression was serious, almost grim. "Richard?" I asked, standing to shake his hand. He nodded, taking the seat beside me. "Thank you for meeting me. I know this must be strange." "I've had my share of strange lately," I said with a wry smile. "What's this about?" Richard hesitated, his hands clasped tightly. "It's about Emily and Greg. I think you deserve to know the full story." What Richard revealed changed everything. Greg, it turned out, wasn't just some charming colleague. He was part of a larger scheme, something that went beyond infidelity. Richard worked in corporate investigations, and his firm had been tracking Greg for months. Greg had been systematically targeting women in high-profile or wealthy families, using charm and manipulation to gain their trust, and access to their resources. Emily had been one of his marks. "He's done this before," Richard explained. Emily wasn't just another affair. She was a means to an end. My stomach churned as Richard laid out the details. Greg had used his relationship with Emily to position himself for a major financial gain. He'd convinced her to access our joint savings under the guise of starting a side business together. Emily, blinded by her feelings, had done it without hesitation. Greg had even manipulated her into withdrawing funds from her personal inheritance account. The kicker. Greg had planned to vanish with the money. He's already moved significant amounts offshore, Richard said. We believe he was preparing to leave the country before everything came to light. I sat there, stunned. Betrayal upon betrayal. Emily's infidelity was devastating, but this was something else entirely. What happens now? I asked, my voice tight. We've frozen his accounts and informed law enforcement, Richard replied. But it's a tangled web. We're still piecing together the extent of his activities. And Emily? I asked, my heart heavy despite everything. She was a pawn, Richard said, his tone softer. But she's also complicit. Whether she knew the full extent or not, she's going to have to answer for her role in this. That evening, Emily called. I hadn't spoken to her since the confrontation at the restaurant, and hearing her voice stirred a mix of emotions. Mark, she began, her voice trembling. I need to see you. Please. I hesitated, but something in her tone compelled me to agree. We met at a quiet cafe, the same one where I had first spoken to Claire. Emily looked worn, her usual poise replaced by a haunted expression. I didn't know, she said as soon as she sat down. About Greg, about the money. I was stupid. Blind. I stared at her, searching for any sign of deception. You're telling me you didn't know he was using you? I swear, Mark, she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. I thought I loved him. I don't even know what I thought anymore. Her confession was raw, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the woman I had once loved. But it wasn't enough to erase the damage she had done. What do you expect me to do, Emily? I asked, my voice weary. You lied. You cheated. You let him into our lives. I just want to make it right, she said desperately. For you, for the kids. Please, Mark. I'll do whatever it takes. In the days that followed, I struggled with my emotions. Part of me wanted to shut her out completely, to move on and never look back. But another part, the part that remembered the good years, couldn't ignore her plea. Then, one morning, Claire called. There's something you need to see, she said, her tone urgent. She sent me a video, a security feed from Greg's office. It showed him packing up documents, clearly preparing to flee. But what caught my attention was Emily. She was there, confronting him. Their voices were muffled, but her body language was clear, she was angry, demanding answers. When Greg tried to leave, Emily blocked the door, shoving him back. Moments later, security arrived. Emily had turned him in. The revelation hit me like a freight train. Emily had been complicit, yes, but in the end, she had chosen to do the right thing. It didn't erase her betrayal, but it was a step, a small, fragile step, toward redemption. That night, as I tucked the kids into bed, Emily's words echoed in my mind, I just want to make it right. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but for the first time, I considered the possibility. Not for her, not for me, but for the family we had built. A family worth fighting for, even after everything.